Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We are going to do the development of palate today. And the learning objective for today's session are number one, describe the stages of development of primary palate, describe the stages of development of secondary palate, and thirdly, describe the process of development of cleft lip and cleft palate. First of all, development of palate. It begins in the 6th week of the development and it continues till the 12th week. So the most critical time period is from the 6th week till the 9th week as far as development of palate is concerned. There are two stages of the development of the palate. Number one, development of primary palate, and number two, development of the secondary palate. So let's do the development of primary palate. But before doing that, let's revise the development of face. Face develops as uh, there are development of 5 facial prominences. There is one uh, uh, prominence that is in front of the forebrain that is called as frontonasal prominence. Then there are two maxillary prominences on each side, and is another paired prominence that's called as mandibular prominence. This maxillary prominence and mandibular prominence, they develop from the first pharyngeal arc. So the frontonasal prominence, there is development of nasal pit on it, and with the development of nasal pit, the mesenchyme around the nasal pit is differentiated into medial nasal prominence, which is on the medial side of the nasal pit, and lateral nasal prominence, which is on the lateral side of the nasal pit. And these two nasal pits, the medial nasal prominences, these two merge with each other and form intermaxillary segment. So the primary palate will develop from intermaxillary segment. Intermaxillary segment will give rise to the philtrum. It's the central part of the upper lip. Then it also gave rise to the premaxillary part of the maxilla, which bears the 4 incisor teeth and its associated gum. And it's also forms the primary palate. It's the part of the palate which is anterior and medial to the hard palate and posterior to the upper 4 incisor teeth. So this part, primary palate, it develops from the intermaxillary segment, and the line of fusion between the primary palate and secondary palate is marked by there's a V-shaped suture, and there is incisive foramen in the adults. So the primary palate is developing from uh, intermaxillary segment as median palatal processes. These two sides, they merge together and form the primary palate, and this primary palate posteriorly fusing with the secondary palate. The secondary palate is developing is the posterior part, which forms the hard palate as well as the soft palate. It develops as the projection from the maxillary prominence, and these projections are called as lateral palatine processes or lateral palatine shelves. You see there is maxillary prominence, and from the maxillary prominence there are projections here. See, these are lateral palatine processes, and these processes initially are directed inframedially on each side of the tongue. So these are the projections from maxillary prominence called as lateral palatine process or the lateral palatine shelves. Uh, Initially they are in inframedial direction, but in the 7th to 8th week, palatine shelf starts to assume a horizontal position because there is elongation of the jaw which pulls the tongue from its root, and with the downward movement of the tongue, the palatine shells, they start to uh, move towards each other in a horizontal direction. And later on, these two palatine shelves, they fuse with each other. Then there is development of the bone in these lateral palatine shells. The bone extends from the bone developing in maxillary prominence and also from the palatine bone. So these are these lateral palatine shells. There is development of bone in the maxillary prominence, and from here it extends into the lateral palatine processes. Posterior most part of the um hard palate do not ossify, and it will give rise to soft palate. It also includes uvula. So when we see the palate, grossly speaking, there is a suture between the premaxillary part of the maxilla and palatine process of the maxilla, and there is incisive foramen between the secondary palate and primary palate. Here, it's also called incisive fossa, and there is a midline um, suture which is formed by the fusion of the lateral palatine processes of the maxilla. Nasal septum grows from the medial nasal prominences. It starts to develop in 12th week. So it developing from the merged medial nasal prominences and begins at the 9th week but completed at the 12th week. And this downgrowing nasal septum fuses with the hard palate. Uh, Clinically speaking, cleft lip and cleft palate are very important. They are basically two groups of the cleft palate. Incisive foramen marks the boundary between them. It's the reference landmark. So the normally clefts of the lip and palate which lies anterior to the incisive foramen are called anterior cleft anomalies, and those that lie posterior to it they are called as posterior cleft anomalies. So the cleft lip can be unilateral cleft lip. It is formed by failure of fusion of the maxillary prominence with medial nasal prominences on one side, and in the median cleft lip there is a lack of fusion of the two medial nasal prominences, and on the in the bilateral cleft lip there is lack of fusion of the maxillary prominences with medial nasal prominences on both sides. So the cleft palate can be, it is about 1 in 2500 birth it's an incidence, and it's usually common in females. Cleft lip is more common in males, but cleft palate is more common in females. It may be associated or may not be associated with cleft lip, and it may involve only uvula, which is uh, a very common partial cleft of the palate. Or it may also involve soft palate and hard palate. Unilateral and bilateral clefts of the palate are classified as clefts of primary palate, also called anterior palate, or it may be cleft of the secondary palate or posterior palate, or it can be cleft of the primary and secondary palate both. Here you see in the this diagram, A diagram, this is just normal. Here you see these is the upper lip, this is primary palate, and this red color is the secondary palate, and posteriorly there is soft palate with uvula. In this case, there is a cleft of the lip, a unilateral cleft of the lip, you see. And in this diagram C, there is anterior cleft deformity. There is cleft of the upper lip, jaw, and palate extending up to the incisive fossa. But so it's on the one side, it's unilateral. Here you see this same type of cleft is seen on both sides. Anterior cleft anomaly, which is bilateral. There's cleft of the lip, cleft of the jaw, and between this cleft between the primary palate and secondary palate. This is in the E diagram. This is isolated complete cleft of the secondary palate, and here you see in the F there is it's combined interior cleft anomaly as well as posterior cleft. Clefts of the facial clefts can be multifactorial. There can be some genetic causes and maybe non-genetic causes. For example, they are environmental causes. Genetic causes can include some syndromic and non-syndromic. Syndrome means, for example, there are chromosomal abnormalities. For example, in trisomy 13, it is a part of a syndrome. So clefts are appearing as a part of the syndrome. And there can be mutation in a single gene, and which is producing these clefts. That is, it means it's non-syndromic. And there can be environmental factors, for example, use of anticonvulsant drugs and cigarette smoking. It can lead to facial cleft. But how they are producing, what's the mechanism behind it, that is still not clear. Thank you.